Welcome to everyone again on God's Sabbath Day. We've been talking about the Sabbath day the past few weeks. I was thinking back to the time when I first began to observe the Sabbath. It seemed a little strange to me at first. It took a little getting used to. I remember I was out mowing the yard on a riding lawnmower late one Friday afternoon. Now, I knew it was getting late because I could see that the sun was getting low in the sky. Every time I made a turn and headed around back toward my house, I was reminded that it was getting late and would soon be the Sabbath. Now, I was new at this. I was not about to be caught mowing my yard at the start of a Sabbath day. I knew it would be close. I had this urge to get off the mower and run into the house. I could check my computer to see what time the sun would set. Then I could find a clock to see how much time I had left to complete my mowing. But leaving the tractor to go into the house to determine how much time I had left would waste valuable time. What was I to do? What would you have done? Well, we live at the top of a hill and can see for miles. The horizon is very flat. And it suddenly hit me. When did the Sabbath begin? Well, at sundown. I didn't need a computer and a clock. I just needed to keep my eye on the lowering sun. But I was trying my best to keep God's Sabbath day. God probably got a chuckle out of that. I believe he has a sense of humor. But sometimes, especially when we're new at it, we don't always know how to keep the Sabbath. Let's quickly review the Sabbath day. If you will, let's turn to Genesis 1, verse 1. That's Genesis 1, verse 1, the very beginning of the Bible. And let's see if we can determine how the Sabbath should be observed. So let's start at the beginning. Again, let's go to the very beginning at Genesis 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Of course, the rest of chapter 1 tells us that God created the heavens and the earth. God created everything in 6 days. Let's move over to the last verse of Genesis chapter 1. That would be Genesis 1, verse 31. This is about the end here. So Genesis 1:31. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the 6th day. Now the next verse, Genesis 2, verse 1. What was next after the creation? Again, Genesis 2, verse 1. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. Now this was at the end of the 6th day. On the 7th day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. God rested from all his work. Turn to Isaiah chapter 40. That'll be Isaiah chapter 40, verse 28. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 28. So was God completely worn out? Was he worn out from his creation? Was God tired? Was he weary? Did God need to take a break? Isaiah 40, verse 28. It tells us, have you not known? Have you not heard that the everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, faints not, neither is he weary? The word faints here is the Hebrew word ya'of, which means to tire or faint. Weary is yagah in Hebrew, and it means to be exhausted or to be weary. So we see that God doesn't get tired. God doesn't become exhausted. Now, Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 and 3 does say that God rested, at least in the King James anyway. The word rested here is the word Shabbath in the Hebrew, and according to Strong's, it means to cease, to celebrate, to keep the Sabbath, actually. God didn't stop at the end of the 6th day because he was tired. He stopped because he had finished his creation of the heavens and the earth. This phase of God's plan for us was complete. God looked at his creation and he saw that it was good. Perhaps he celebrated it in a sense as well, just as Strong's seems to suggest. How many of us, when we finished a major project, will stop, take a break, and look back on that project and hopefully say to ourselves, our project is complete, it's good. I know when I lived on a farm as a child, each year we came to the end of our growing season. The fields were harvested. Much of our work was done for the entire year. We would take a break and look back at what we'd accomplished. It made us happy to know what we'd been able to accomplish in that growing season. We took a break from our hard labor. Of course, this didn't last long. It would soon be time to engage in winter activities and get back to work. Still, you might say we celebrated our accomplishment, if only temporarily. On that seventh day, God looked back at his creation. It's a very special day to him and to us. Now, I think we know that a day is as 1,000 years to the Lord. And most believe that after 6,000 years of man battling the earth, other humans, and Satan, this will pretty much come to an end in the seventh day, or the 7,000th year period of man's existence. I think we know that 1,000-year period, of course, as the millennium. But God made the seventh day of the week unlike the rest. God made the seventh day holy. He set apart the seventh day. God's seventh day was actually created for man. That's right, it was created for us. As Jesus said in Mark 2, verse 27, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. It was created for our benefit. It shouldn't be a burden. In fact, if it's a burden to us, then we must be doing something wrong. And I'll say to those who are not yet keeping God's Sabbaths, you don't know what you're missing. It's a time when we can rest, and as humans, we certainly can use the rest. Like God's first Sabbath, it's time for us to reflect on what God has done. Also, it's a time to reflect on what we've accomplished in the previous 6 days. Our daily study of Scripture has hopefully brought us better understanding. But the Sabbath is when we have an entire day to learn and grow closer to God. Each Sabbath day, we have an appointment with God and our brethren. God made this appointment with us at creation. This appointment has never been changed nor canceled. In fact, the Sabbath is a sign between God and his people forever. After speaking about the Sabbath a few weeks ago, I received several questions regarding how we should observe the Sabbath. So today, I'm going to tell everyone exactly how to do that. Are we ready? Well, I'd like to be able to tell everyone exactly what to do on God's holy Sabbath days, but we have a couple of problems. First, remember that our number one relationship is to be with God. We're to follow Christ as best we understand how. Now, I can try to provide some scriptures to guide us. I can make some suggestions and recommendations, but ultimately, it comes down to what the Word of God tells us as individuals. We should always make decisions on how to live based on prayer and careful study of his Word. And second, keeping the Sabbath isn't exactly the same for everyone. Now, right now, I am breaking God's commandment regarding the Sabbath day. I'm doing so at this very moment. So, am I setting a bad example for the rest of us? Let's see what God has to say about how to keep the Sabbath day in his Holy Bible. I notice there seem to be 3 things in particular God expects us to do on his Sabbath day. Let's head over to Exodus 20, where we can find the 10 Commandments, of course. That's Exodus 20, and we'll go to verse 8. Exodus 20, verse 8. And of course, we'll be looking at the 4th of the 10 Commandments. Let's take a look at the first thing we're commanded to do. Again, Exodus 20, verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Of course, God didn't declare the Sabbath day here in Exodus. We saw earlier that God created the Sabbath at the time of creation. Here, he was reminding the Israelites to keep the Sabbath. I suspect some had lost the habit, just as so many have today. But if we're keeping the commandments of God, the 4th and longest of the 10 Commandments certainly deserves our attention. Verse 9. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work. Just as God did, we are to rest or cease from our work after 6 days of labor. Verse 10. But the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, your manservant, nor your maidservant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger that is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the Sabbath day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So what does verse 10 tell us? where we're told that we are not to work on the Sabbath day. We're to refrain from our work. And not only us, but our children and servants as well. And that's the first thing on my list that God expects of us, to refrain from work on the Sabbath day. Let's turn next to Leviticus chapter 23. That's Leviticus chapter 23, and we'll go to verse 3. The second thing we see is that we're instructed to have a sacred assembly. That's what most of us recognize as going to church. So again, Leviticus chapter 23, verse 3. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work therein. It is the Sabbath of the Lord in all your dwellings. Holy convocation is a sacred assembly, as we've talked about before. And we know that iron sharpens iron. On the day that God appointed, we're to come together. We're to learn from each other, to be inspired by each other's stories, to help us grow in love for Christ and each other. Let's go on to the third thing here. A third thing to do that God expects is to be found in Isaiah 58:13. We won't turn there just yet. We'll look at Isaiah shortly, but we're told there that we're not to seek our own pleasure on the Sabbath. In other words, our focus should be on God on the Sabbath day. We shouldn't plan activities that distract us from our focus on God. Imagine we planned a big day at the NASCAR racetrack. We might get up early to travel to the track. We'd be focused on racing that day. Our focus would not be on God and spiritual things. We likely wouldn't have time for a holy convocation that day. Now, we're to devote the Sabbath day to spending time with God and each other. Remember the two greatest commandments. Jesus said in Matthew 22, verse 27, he said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." The Sabbath day gives us time to spend with God and each other, free from the distractions of the world, free from the work we normally have to do, to spend quality time with God and each other, time we'd rarely get otherwise these days. So how does God want us to observe the Sabbath day? Now, unlike God, we need physical rest. And probably more and more today, many of us need a mental break from our jobs just as much. Now, we're to refrain from work on the Sabbath. We're to rest. We're to assemble together, and we're to keep the focus of God on the Sabbath day. We aren't to plan a big day out that isn't focused on God. I think most of us are aware that we're to rest on the Sabbath day and keep it holy or special. But I often get questions about just exactly what we should and shouldn't do on the Sabbath. What should we not do on the Sabbath? Well, we know we should not work. For example, I work in an office Monday through Friday. I'm off on the Sabbath day. But sometimes in my line of work, things must be done on the weekends. That's just how it is. When that becomes necessary, I schedule my time to avoid working on the Sabbath. Has there ever been an emergency that occurred on the Sabbath day that needed immediate attention? Well, yes, that does occur occasionally. What happens then? We'll get to that in just a little bit. But it's not just our primary form of employment, you might say. We should not perform routine maintenance on our vehicles or clean our gutters on the Sabbath day. These things should be done, of course, on the regular work days. These things are work for us and would, to a degree at least, deprive us of the rest and spiritual nourishment and growth that the Sabbath day was intended for. Mark 15, verse 42. Let's turn to Mark 15, verse 42. In order that we can rest on the Sabbath, the day before Sabbath is the preparation day. We prepare for the Sabbath the day before. We do all the work needed to allow us that day of rest and devotion to God that we talked about. Now here in verse 42, we find ourselves on the day before a Sabbath. Notice the preparation is defined as the day preceding the Sabbath day. Again, Mark 15, verse 42. And now when the even was come, because it was a preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, an honorable counselor, which also waited for the kingdom of God, came and went in boldly unto Pilate and craved the body of Jesus. You might recall that they wanted to get Jesus in his tomb before the Sabbath day, because, of course, burial was considered work. So what about cooking on the Sabbath day? I sometimes get questions about that. Let's turn over to Exodus chapter 16. Exodus chapter 16, and we'll start in verse 23. Here we find the Israelites likely had lost sight of the Sabbath and how to observe it. Here in Exodus, God, by way of Moses, was trying to get them back on track. Again, that's Exodus 16, verse 23. And this time I'll be reading from the Bible in Basic English in that translation. So here we go. And he, Moses, said, "This is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is a day of rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. What has to be cooked may be cooked, and what is over, or left over, put on one side to be kept till the morning." Here in verse 23, Moses told the people to cook whatever they were going to cook the day before the Sabbath day. They were to do this, of course, on the preparation day. Now, what was left over, they were to eat the next day. Most of us know what it's like to prepare a typical Thanksgiving dinner. Often those preparing that meal get up early and work a large part of the day to prepare the meal. That's right, they work a large part of the day. And that's definitely work. So, am I saying we shouldn't prepare anything to eat on the Sabbath day? Well, no, not at all. But back in the days of Exodus, preparing meals was quite a chore. Typically, a fire would have to be started. Before that, one might have to go gather some sticks to get the fire started. You might recall it didn't work out so well for the man that gathered sticks on the Sabbath day. That was back in Numbers chapter 15. In fact, he was killed because of it. There were no refrigerators or microwaves in those days. Cooking was work. And now we see the Israelites kept their leftovers from the preparation day, and ate them on the Sabbath. Excuse me. Now again, I'm reading this from the Bible in Basic English. But regarding the food they prepared on the preparation day, Exodus 16, verse 24, and they kept it till the morning, as Moses had said, and no smell came from it, and it had no worms. And Moses says, "Make your meal today of what you have, for this day is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not get any in the fields." God was teaching his people not to spend time cooking on the Sabbath day. Again, spending a lot of time cooking or doing anything else, the distraction of the Sabbath should be avoided. Verse 26. "For 6 days you will get it, but on the seventh day, the Sabbath, there will not be any. But still, on the seventh day, some of the people went out to get it, and there was not any. And the Lord said to Moses, How long will you go against my orders and my laws? See, because the Lord has given you the Sabbath, he gives you on the sixth day bread enough for 2 days. Let every man keep where he is. Let no man go out of his place on the seventh day." So the people took their rest on the seventh day. Today we have refrigerators and microwaves. Food preparation can be very fast and very easy. Perhaps a bowl of cereal or a sandwich takes little time and doesn't interfere with our Sabbath day. But spending hours in the kitchen mixing and baking, well, that's a different story. I think the idea here is that we shouldn't have anyone stuck in the kitchen for any appreciable length of time on the Sabbath. And we shouldn't need to make a trip to the supermarket on the Sabbath to purchase food. We should have already done that, purchasing it, if necessary, on the preparation day. In fact, buying, selling, or otherwise conducting business is also prohibited on the Sabbath day, because that would be a form of work. Nehemiah 10, verse 28. Let's take a look over there. That's Nehemiah chapter 10, verse 28. Now, here the people were turning back to serve God, something they hadn't been doing, but they're about to. They're going to start. So Nehemiah 10, verse 28. "And the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the porters, the singers, the Nethinims, and all they that had separated themselves from the people of the lands unto the law of God, their wives, their sons, and their daughters, everyone having knowledge and having understanding. They clave to their brethren, their nobles, and entered into a curse. Now, the word curse here would be better translated as an agreement. And into an oath to walk in God's law, which was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe and do all the commandments of the Lord our God, and his judgments and his statutes. And that we would not give our daughters unto the people of the land, or take their daughters for our sons. Now notice, as you read in verse 31, that people brought things into Jerusalem for sale on the Sabbath. But the people refused to purchase any of it on the Sabbath day. They refused to buy or sell. They would not conduct business on the Sabbath day. Verse 31. And if the people of the land bring ware or any victuals on the Sabbath day to sell, that we would not buy it of them on the Sabbath or on the holy day. Now, ware here is merchandise in general, and victuals are food or grain. I'd like to reread that to you in the Bible in basic English. That's verse 31. And if the peoples of the lands come to do trade in goods or food on the Sabbath day, then we would do no trade with them on the Sabbath. If you would, let's turn back to Exodus 20. I know we were just there a few minutes ago. But let's go back to Exodus 20, verse 10. That's Exodus chapter 20, and we'll look at verse 10. So we're not to buy, sell, or conduct business on the Sabbath day. And it appears that the people would not purchase food in addition to not purchasing general merchandise. And that brings up an interesting question. But first, let's look at verse 10 here, Exodus 20, verse 10. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, your manservant, nor your maidservant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger that is within your gates. Okay. Now we know that we are not to do any work on the Sabbath. But who else is included in this prohibition from work? Well, as we just saw, we're not to have our children do any work. I can just see this now, No, God, I didn't work on the Sabbath. I just sent my children to work instead. That wouldn't make any sense. Even if it wasn't said specifically in the commandment, it wouldn't make any sense. I think everyone understands that if it's wrong for us, it's wrong for our children as well. But what about our servants? What about those who serve us? If we manage others where we work, should we send them out to work on the Sabbath day? Maybe these people aren't our personal servants, but they are following our orders. They serve us to an extent. Now, I never schedule anything for myself or my staff on a Sabbath day. If necessary, I schedule the time after the Sabbath. That way, if it takes longer than expected, it won't interfere with anyone's Sabbath day. Now, it's clear that God commands us not to have our servants work on the Sabbath. To many people, this would include anyone they hire or pay on the Sabbath day. But others see it differently. And this can be an area of confusion. So since we're here, let's talk about one of the things that I know some of us believe differently. And that is whether dining out on the Sabbath is breaking the Sabbath or not. If God tells us not to have our servants perform work for us, anyone we pay to work for us on the Sabbath day is in our employ, if only for a temporary amount of time. So would it be wrong to intentionally hire someone to install a new deck at our house on a Sabbath day? What do you think about that? Is it a violation of God's commandment to have others work for us on the Sabbath? Well, for those that answer yes, when it comes time to dining out during the Sabbath, they will say this is exactly the same thing. In both cases, we'd be contracting with someone to serve us in some way, and that would make them our servants. In fact, the person that serves us in a restaurant is called a server, and that might be a problem. In addition, we'd be making a business transaction as well. On the other hand, some are just fine with this. Many will look at the within your gates at the very end of Exodus 20, verse 10. The idea here is that within your gates applies only to those in the household that you're responsible for. Therefore, if we leave our houses, we can hire all the servants we want. So in this area of thought, this prohibition on servants does not apply if you're not at home. And back in Nehemiah, those refusing to purchase food did so within the gates of the city. So again, many, and I'd say most of us, are fine with purchasing food on the Sabbath day. I know some churches make it their official doctrine that having a meal out on the Sabbath day is just fine. But there are those that don't. They consider hiring someone to serve us on the Sabbath day to be wrong wherever we might employ them. And they usually believe that the stranger within our gates refers to someone who might be temporarily staying with us at our residence. We would then have to see to it that they do no work on the Sabbath. In other words, as head of the household, we are to prohibit anyone, in addition to our children and our regular servants, from working on the Sabbath in our homes. Those outside the gates, we have no right to stop them from working. They're outside our gates. They're outside our authority. But in reality, what I seem to see is that the position of the individual usually takes the form of the position that the church they attend does. Now, there's some exceptions, but most of the time people seem to go along with whatever their church teaches on the subject. Many never stop to examine this topic, but I think we should. And we should do whatever we become convicted of. Now, at this point, you may be wondering what my position is on this. Well, I understand that people disagree on whether it's wrong to eat out on the Sabbath day or not. To pay someone to cook food and serve it to us on the Sabbath day. Well, I don't condemn anyone for doing either. That decision is between all of us and God. Having said that, I do my best to accommodate everyone. You might notice that at the Feast of Tabernacles, we try to make food available to those who do not want to go out on the Sabbath day. Those that choose to eat out on the Sabbath day, of course, are free to do so. But we won't schedule a group meal out on the Sabbath day, since that might exclude some of us. And we want us to be together as much as we can on the Sabbath. After all, that's what it's all about. For our family, here's how we handle it here. We basically try to follow the example we just saw in Nehemiah. We always have enough food in the house before the Sabbath day begins. If we're low on food, we make sure we pick up whatever we might need on the preparation day. On the Sabbath day, either the food is prepared the day before, or we might have something like, say, sandwiches or maybe some potato chips. Something simple and fast. It takes no time at all to do this. We might turn on the oven to bake a pre-made pizza. Then it just takes a minute or two to pop it in the oven and later remove it and cut it into slices. Now, I know what you're thinking. Technically, that is baking, but not the way baking was done when it was a labor and time-intensive job in the past. But to tell you the truth, actually, salads and fresh fruit can be prepared ahead of time and require no cooking, and they would probably be better for us, make us more healthy for us anyway, put it that way. But anyway, it takes less time to prepare a meal on the Sabbath day than it usually takes for us to eat it. So that way we have more time to spend in study or in fellowship with the brethren. This helps make for a quiet and restful Sabbath for us. It gives us more time for spiritual things. In fact, we usually don't leave the house unless it's to go to church or visit with brethren. Now, as always, we need to study our Bibles. We need to rightly divide the word of truth. We're to follow Christ the best we can. And we should always do what we believe to be true, not just what anyone else tells us to do, not me or anyone else. So remember, you have to seek this out yourself and become convicted of what you believe is the right thing to do, and then do it. Let's switch gears for a minute. Talk about some history. Back around the year 1492, Columbus wasn't the only story coming out of Spain. The Jews were given 4 months to convert to Catholicism or leave the country. It said that soldiers would go out through the countryside looking for Jews that had not converted to Catholicism. But how was it they were able to locate those Jews? How did they know that those living in one house were Jews and the next house were not? Anyone know? Okay. Any ideas? Okay, they knew who the Jews were by their chimneys. You see, the Jews would not kindle a fire on the Sabbath day. In fact, they'd have no fire of any kind burning in their homes on any Sabbath day. Turn over to Exodus 35, verse 1, if you would. That's Exodus chapter 35, verse 1. Exodus 35, verse 1. Now, all the soldiers had to do was pass through the area during the winter months on the Sabbath day. If there was no smoke coming out of the chimney, well, these were obviously Jews that need to be thrown out of Spain. Let's take a look at the passage that's most likely responsible for this. Again, this is Exodus 35, verse 1. And Moses gathered all the congregation of the children of Israel together and said to them, These are the words which the Lord has commanded, that you should do them. 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day there shall be to you a holy day, a Sabbath of rest to the Lord. Whoever does work therein shall be put to death. But notice verse 3. You shall kindle no fire throughout your habitations upon the Sabbath day. Now, verse 3 is where the Jews likely got the idea that they could not have a fire to keep warm on the Sabbath. So the question is that true? Should we never have a fire on the Sabbath? Not in a fireplace? Not in a wood-burning stove? Not a kerosene or propane heater? What about heating our homes with natural gas? Is that prohibited? I believe there are a couple of things to consider here. The first thing you might notice is that God said not to kindle a fire, or not to start a fire. Well, I have a wood-burning stove myself. I know sometimes that starting a fire in my stove can be frustrating and take a long time to get started. It's not always an easy task for us. And that's not the best way to spend time on the Sabbath day. But in the winter, when I use it for heat, I usually don't kindle a fire on the Sabbath. The fire's already burning on the Sabbath day. Do I occasionally place another log on the fire? Well, of course, yes, I do. But I don't kindle or build a fire on the Sabbath day. Now, if I think I'll need a fire on the Sabbath day, I'll be sure to kindle it or start it before the Sabbath if it's not already burning. Now, I was already doing this without paying any attention to Exodus 3, verse 3, because it made sense to me anyway. I don't want to spend part of my Sabbath fighting with the stove trying to get a fire started, which I often do. However, people who were preparing to cook a big meal back in those days needed to kindle a fire just to cook, or needed to kindle a fire to do other work in some cases. Now, I personally believe that Exodus 35, verse 3 was a prohibition on starting a fire to cook or do other work. Remember, cooking took a long time back then. And if we read verse 3 in the contemporary English version of the Bible, it actually says this: Don't build a cooking fire at home on the Sabbath. As I said, we know cooking these old ovens was definitely work. So this doesn't surprise me. I'm thinking they would not have kindled a fire for warmth on the Sabbath because it was already burning, most likely. But they would need to kindle a fire even in the summertime if they were about to cook or use the fire for work. So my opinion is that there is no issue with running a wood-burning stove or any other type of stove to stay warm in the wintertime. Although I would suggest starting a fire if necessary the day before, or sooner if needed. And in the case of a wood-burning stove, we should probably have the wood available for us and ready to feed the fire. We don't want to go out and pick up sticks like the one man did we talked about. And that would cause the least disruption for the Sabbath. So I don't particularly agree with the Jews prohibiting fire on the Sabbath day altogether. So, excuse me. To me, I believe our Bibles tell us that we're to provide for our families. If we don't, then we're worse than non-believers. And you can read about that in 1 Timothy 5, verse 8. But I believe that not providing warmth and security for our families in the wintertime would seem to be a much greater issue than having a fire to keep them warm. I know we talked about the Jews not wanting to push buttons on an elevator on the Sabbath. And the reason for this was because when a switch contact closes, there's this very tiny spark that occurs. And the Jews consider that tiny spark as kindling a fire on the Sabbath. But I don't believe this is what God was talking about when he said not to kindle a fire on the Sabbath. I believe he was talking about preparing to do work. So if you don't plan to bake with your kindled fire, if you don't plan to use a fire in your home to work with metals or perform some other kind of work, I see no issue with having a fire to keep warm. I just recommend that we have the fire started before the Sabbath, particularly if you struggle sometimes to get it started like I do. Now, are there any exceptions to these rules or commandments we've been talking about today? Let's talk about exceptions. Are there any? Anybody know of any? How about Matthew 12, verse 1? Let's look over there. Matthew chapter 12, verse 1. We'll begin with the Pharisees who were complaining to Jesus that his disciples were sinning for plucking ears of corn to eat out of a field. Again, that's Matthew chapter 12, verse 1. And those Pharisees are trying to condemn Jesus yet again. At that time, Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and his disciples were hungry and began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Behold, your disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day." But he, Jesus, said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and they that were with him? How he entered into the house of God and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat? Neither for them which were with him, but only for the priests." Now David and his soldiers were fleeing from Saul. Well, this was kind of a crisis, an emergency, you might say. So the priests provided for their immediate need. Okay? Let's talk about me for a minute. What about me? Well, I typically work at least 3 hours on the Sabbath every week. I bring the equipment online. We perform preliminary sound checks. We adjust sound levels. Check the network connections for our 2 separate streams. Make sure all our batteries are charged and all backup devices are loaded and on standby. We check our video status. Jackie reviews her music and warms up her flute, while I make final adjustments to the audio levels. And none of this can be done beforehand. And after the service, have to shut everything down. In fact, here's my checklist. I don't know if you can see this or not, but this is a checklist of things we have to do on the Sabbath to prepare for this broadcast. It takes a while. I'm happy to do it, but make no mistake, this is work performed on the Sabbath day. In fact, by the way, I forgot to mention this. We had a technical failure today. It took a while to fix. I had to get some tools out and fix it. And that would certainly work to get fixed, but it had to be done for this broadcast to go out. So am I in trouble with God? Am I breaking the Sabbath day? What do you think? Well, I'm counting on our very next verse, verse 5, to excuse me from working on the Sabbath day. If this isn't a good excuse, then we have an awful lot of pastors out there who are in trouble. Matthew 12, verse 5, the next verse, verse 5. Or have you not read in the law that how on the Sabbath day the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Now, I'm not a Levitical priest, but I'm hoping that God sees those working in his service on the Sabbath day and will hold them blameless as well. I hope so. Verse 6. But I say to you, that in this place is one greater than the temple. But if you had known what this means, I will have mercy, and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. And when he was departed thence, he went into the synagogue. And behold, there was a man which had his hand withered. And they asked him, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath days? That they might accuse him. They were trying to accuse him again. He said to them, What man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep, and if it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? How much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath days. In my last 13 years of employment, I've had 3 days where I had an emergency at work. Now, each time I had to drive into work and solve the problem. I don't think I was gone over 2 hours on any of those Sabbaths, and only on one Sabbath did it affect me attending Sabbath services. But children's welfare was depending on me to get those issues fixed. I believe we can and should plan to keep Sabbath interruptions to a minimum. But sometimes things go wrong, and then we need to do good on the Sabbath day. When something unexpected comes up on the Sabbath, sometimes we just need to react to it. Look over at Luke 14, verse 1. You're probably more familiar with this one. Luke 14, verse 1. Luke chapter 14, verse 1. So I believe we need to do everything we can to prevent being interrupted on our Sabbath day. But if the unexpected happens, we sometimes need to work to address the situation. Again, Luke 14, verse 1. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. And it came to pass, as he went into the house of one of the chief Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath day, that they watched him. And behold, there was a certain man before him which had the dropsy. And Jesus answering spake unto the lawyers and the Pharisees, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath day? And they held their peace. And he took him and healed him and let him go. And answered them, saying, Which of you shall have an ass or an ox fallen into a pit, and will not straightway pull him out on the Sabbath day? And they could not answer him again to these things. Now, this is what we often hear of as the ox in the ditch. Yes, the Sabbath day is a day of rest. But when it becomes necessary to assist and show love to others, or even our animals, it's okay to do good on the Sabbath day. Isaiah 56, verse 1, if you would. We're winding down a little here. Isaiah chapter 56, verse 1. Now, God promises to bless those who keep his Sabbath. Let's read about that in Isaiah chapter 56, verse 1. I'll be reading here from the contemporary English version of the Bible. So again, Isaiah 56, verse 1, about our blessings. The Lord said, Be honest and fair. Soon I will come to save you. My saving power will be seen everywhere on earth. I will bless everyone who respects the Sabbath and refuses to do wrong. Foreigners who worship me must not say, The Lord won't let us be part of his people. Men who are unable to become fathers must no longer say, We're dried up trees. To them, I, the Lord, say, Respect the Sabbath. Obey me completely and keep our agreement. Then I will set up monuments in my temple with your names written on them. This will be much better than having children, because these monuments will stand forever. Foreigners will follow me. They will love me and worship in my name. They will respect the Sabbath and keep our agreement. So, to conclude today, God blessed and hallowed the seventh day of the week. The Sabbath day was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath day is a blessing to us if we allow it to be so, if we observe it as God intended, as God commanded us to do. How are we to observe God's Sabbath day? God tells us not to work on the Sabbath, but rather rest from our labors. He tells us not to do our own pleasure, but rather we are to spend that time with him and each other. This is a day for a sacred assembly. Today we talked about some specific questions people have and looked at other customs that some have. I often get questions about what is considered work on the Sabbath day, what we should and shouldn't do. But after all this, let me see if I can just sum this up very quickly. My answer to all those questions probably goes something like this regarding the Sabbath day. We're to prepare ahead of time for the Sabbath day. That's what the preparation day is for. We need to do our very best to have all our chores and regular work finished by the end of the preparation day. The Sabbath day should be free from work and distractions as much as possible so we can make our appointment with God and each other. But always remember that the two greatest commandments are to love God and each other. If we need to serve God or help out in an emergency situation, we can and should make the occasional exception. But I think we can probably sum this up with one simple question. I think this is all you have to do is ask yourself this one question, and that'll answer your question. Here it is. The question is, have we planned to have a distraction-free Sabbath where we can spend time with God and the brethren? If you answer yes to that question, I'd say we're keeping the Sabbath correctly. I think that's all it comes down to. I'd like to close today with Isaiah 58, verses 13 and 14. That's Isaiah chapter 58. We'll read 2 verses, 13 and 14. The Sabbath day is a gift from God. Let's receive this gift with great thanksgiving. Let's allow the Sabbath to bless us as it was intended, by keeping it as God directed. After all, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Again, Isaiah 58, verse 13. I'll be reading today in the International Standard Version. Isaiah 58, verse 13. If you keep your feet from trampling the Sabbath, from pursuing your own interest on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honorable, and if you honor it by not going your own ways and seeking your own pleasures or speaking merely idle words, then you will take delight in the Lord, and he will make you ride upon the heights of the earth, and he will make you feast on the inheritance of your ancestor Jacob, your father. Yes, the mouth of the Lord has spoken it.